have you been reading? Are you reading? What books are you reading? The one thing I'd thank Donald Trump for is political education. You can't not listen to Guantanamo in Cuba.
Hi, it's Hugo Harvey here, and you're about to watch me interview Jeremy Corbyn ahead of him heading out to Cuba to show solidarity as Trump threatens to take it. I hope you enjoy. Can you tell us a little bit about the event tonight and the situation in Cuba right now?
The event tonight is a music fundraiser here in Highbury, and we put this together to raise money for medical aid and support for Cuba. And it's part of the Peace and Justice Project Music for the Many programme, which Sam Sweek has organised. And this has been defending live music venues, as well as giving opportunity for previously unknown or unheard bands, giving them all space. And so we've done a lot of these concerts over the past few years, and we've got a whole festival coming up in June in Hackney for 3 days of it. And the concerts are usually concerning defending live music venues. Many around the country we've sought to defend, but it's also about supporting particular causes. So we've done a lot of concerts for Palestine, and tonight we've done one for Cuba, because Cuba is under the most intense blockade ever, shortages of just about everything, and we're raising money and buying a lot of medicines, medical equipment, and art material for children, just about everything that people need. And Cuba Solidarity is sending a whole container load over, but clearly that takes time, and air freight is very expensive. There's very few planes going to Cuba anyway, and so I'm travelling to Cuba tomorrow with a small delegation of us for an event in Havana on Saturday of Nuestra America, Our America, in which the radical movements, the left and trade unions and so on, all across the whole of the Americas, Caribbean, South America, North America, are coming together to declare our support for Cuba. And I'm taking as much medical supplies and equipment as I can pack into a suitcase and taking those tomorrow morning. So we're here for Cuba, and there's something quite poignant about it, that Cuba has provided medical aid for the whole world over the past 60 years. Wherever there's been a problem, be it earthquake, flood or Ebola, Cuba's there. So we got to be there for Cuba.
And today Trump has said that he would have the honor of taking Cuba. Why do you think Trump wants to take Cuba?
Because it's a threat to his cultural hegemony over the whole of the continent. His strategy, the strategy document he produced last September, was about saying that anything in the Americas, as in the Monroe Doctrine, is the property of the United States. He sees Venezuela, he sees Nicaragua, he sees Cuba as bizarrely under foreign influences. That's the words he uses. And he sees Cuba as a threat. It's not a threat in any military sense of any sort. Cuba is a threat of an example. It is possible, even in a relatively poor country, to have universal free medicine, to have universal free education, to have sustainable energy and sustainable agriculture. These things are all possible. And that anyone who has not had good advantages in school, go back to school, go back to college, go back to uni. It's about education and about liberation of people's minds. And so I think he feels threatened by all this. It hasn't bought into the materialism that he loves. Instead, it's bought into something different.
And when you talk about the Monroe Doctrine and this idea of cultural hegemony, alongside the attacks on Venezuela and Iran, do you see this as Trump trying to create a new world order, or is this just a naked revelation of what's always been true, which is might makes right?
He has imagination that is limited to the idea of eternal growth of wealth of a minority, and that there is a slight bit of trickle down that might get through to a few people, and that he can then please his base in America by saying he's defending American jobs by bringing in low-priced raw materials from Africa or Latin America and turning those into cars and washing machines and so on in the USA. But in reality, he is funded by global capital, who are not really very interested in whether a car is made in China, the USA, Britain, or Korea. They don't really care. They just want to make money out of that car. Trump pretends to be a US nationalist. In reality, he is a free market capitalist that believes in free market, but somehow or other thinks that by creating a tariff wall around the USA, he will protect the USA from its technical inferiority to the speed of development in Korea, Japan, India, and China. So we're watching sort of political contradictions being played out before our very eyes. But those contradictions are brutal because they're played out with 1,000 bases around the world, with $1 trillion a year of expenditure on arms, and the political backing of all the arms manufacturers to the Republican Party in the USA. And so it's a virtuous circle. He goes to war, he buys more weapons, the manufacturers pay him to be elected to buy more weapons, and so it goes on and on. Who are the losers? Who are the losers? The poorest people in the poorest countries, the Palestinian people, the Iranian people, the Cuban people, and so many others around the world. And so the one thing I'd thank Donald Trump for is political education. The whole world can see it for what it is.
So with that idea of the Cuban example, and also this idea of different models of economies playing out, Cuba under Castro was this example of delivering for everyday people. But do you think that has become less viable now with the loss of Venezuela and the loss of the USSR's subsidizing it? Is Cuba still able to deliver for everyday Cubans? Because since 2022, there's been 1 million people left. Now they have a nationwide blackout. Is that model, is that Cuban example still viable?
Cuba, after the revolution in 1959, then became reliant very heavily on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for manufactured goods and so on. And in fact, it developed its economy very much as part of the Comecon model. I first went to Cuba in the 1980s, and whilst there's much I admired, there was much I was shocked by. I was shocked by the waste. I was shocked by the strange idea that you could develop, for example, a factory producing rayon in Cuba with the machinery and the raw materials all imported from East Germany, then exported back to East Germany. Sorry, Cuba grows cotton. Why not grow cotton and make cotton goods? There's plenty of other examples. There have been a number of other times since then, and what I have noticed is that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the great difficulties of the special period meant that they did start to change the agricultural basis. They took away the obsession with sugar and went much more for sustainable agriculture and development of their own agriculture to provide food. And Cuba is well able to feed itself. It's not that big a population, it's a big island. They can. Maybe not all the food they want, but they can produce enough to be sustainable. Now, many people have left Cuba out of desperation because they want something better. They don't dislike Cuba, they don't dislike the achievements of Cuba, but they feel that the strangulation of the blockade is a serious issue. And so I do think that these are perilous moments for Cuba. That's why we have to give all the support they can, and we can. And I suspect that Cuba will get through. Will get through because it is a very innovative society and country. And as Eddie Dempsey was explaining, that the growth of solar-powered electric generation means that they will eventually produce not as much electricity as they could possibly use, but enough to be sustainable. They'll have more problems over vehicles because you can't convert to electric vehicles very easily, and they're very expensive anyway. And so there is going to be a need for oil for quite a long time to come. Where that oil will come from, only Cuba knows, I don't know. But I do think we should give all the support we can now. I hate to see a beautiful place that's achieved so much in education, in art and poetry and music, so much in medicine, and solidarity of the peoples of the world just being strangled before our very eyes. So we're there to loosen those ropes and allow Cuba to breathe.
I know you mentioned your trips. Do you think the independence of the Caribbean specifically is of importance to you? I know you went to Jamaica, and that was part of your political awakening, and you cite your personal trips to Cuba. Is the Caribbean of specific interest to you?
Well, it's been a very important part of my life, and I learnt a great deal by living in Jamaica as a young man, because I'd been brought up with very traditional British history, and at school, not at home, but at school, the standard colonial outlook of that time. I arrived in Jamaica just after independence, and I saw the flowering of the culture and the language and the poetry and the music as, in part, the declaration of their own independence, in part just the vivacity of the society. It was wonderful. And then you think of the horrors of the history of the Caribbean, the slave trade, the murder of tens of thousands of people, the genocide against the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean by the colonial settlers, by those that landed in Santo Domingo in the first place when Columbus landed there and spread European diseases which wiped out the entire population. Then the importation of slaves from Africa, many of whom died on the way there. Who ended the slave trade? The brave slaves of Morant Bay and other places in Western Jamaica, who rendered the sugar trade impossible by their industrial action, and that led to the abolition of slavery. It was slaves who freed themselves from slavery.
And some people have said, you know, Cuba's history involves Castro overthrowing Batista after even getting independence from Spain, and America's involvement starts with getting Cuba independence from Spain. But a lot of people talk about how Cuba hasn't been free basically ever in its history in terms of a society of civil liberties. And with the societies that Trump tends to target, it's the main criticism levied against them is often lack of civil liberties. How do you feel about the lack of civil liberties in places like Iran, Venezuela, and specifically Cuba?
I want civil liberties for everybody. I want rights for people, LGBT rights and all the other rights. And but Cuba has changed and is changing. I remember on a visit to Cuba in the 80s having an argument that lasted for a very long time with a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party about gay rights. And I told him, he said, isn't it a imperialist and European disease? And I said, well, I'd rather you didn't use the word disease and instead started looking at people. And I said, by the way, the mayor of my borough here in Islington is a very out gay man. He said, really? I said, yeah, and what's more than that, he's a very close friend of mine, and I strongly support him. And so we went into this long argument, but then go back to Cuba a few years later, things have changed. Things do change. And so I do think that every society has to be content with itself, that it can allow freedom of expression. And I do think the fundamentals of the Cuban Revolution about land, about food, about education, and about opportunities are absolutely there. And I admire that, what they've achieved. And so Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, achieved the most incredible changes. I think the mistake, if they did make mistakes, everybody does, was they over-relied on the very high price of oil at that time and didn't diversify the economy enough. But people grow and people learn, and the left in Latin America is much more resilient than the rest of the world gives it. But the last thing I want is for us as the European left, who after all have achieved some things, but other things we've failed to achieve. We still have our governments that take us to war. We still have our government spending our money on nuclear weapons and so on. It's not up to us to tell the people of Cuba, Venezuela, or anywhere else how to conduct their struggle. If we want them to succeed in their struggle, it's solidarity, not dictation.
And one other thing I'd like to ask is, do you think in some way the party is over? In terms of the 20th century, we saw these examples rise, but there was this great combat between imperialism and, let's say, socialism in Latin America. A lot of people now don't really buy into the imperialism of Trump, as there's no domestic support for the war in Iran. But at the same time, these socialist examples are dying out partially because of their over-reliance on the price of oil, in the case of Venezuela, or in the case of Cuba, over-relying on Venezuelan oil. What does the future hold in terms of this battle between hope and imperialism, if that makes sense?
It's a council of despair. Who have you been reading? Are you reading? What books are you reading? Hang on, let's have a think about this. How did Zoran Mandani get elected? How did Bernie Sanders do so well? Huh? It didn't all come from nowhere. It comes from people wanting something better and decent in their society. It comes from organising in your community to protect a nursery from closure, to make sure a piece of wasteland is turned into a park, to make sure your school isn't closed, to make sure you have art and music in your school, not just maths and science. It is about protecting jobs. It is about better wages. It is about free expression. It is about rights of people. Those are all revolutions, and they're happening all the time. So I think don't read Niall Ferguson. I really don't advise it. Read Howard Zinn.
And we're obviously at a music event now.
Yes.
What do you think the role of music is finally in resistance?
I think music is an incredibly powerful message. And you go through history, the power of music to enthuse, excite, entertain, and educate people is massive. You think of the English folk tradition. Those were actually revolutionary songs about workers' rights, revolutionary songs about the inequalities of those societies. That was the oral tradition of passing ideas down from one generation to another, when 90% of the population were illiterate. The strength of music in the Andean community that created that spirit of a sense of unity. And then in later political struggles, those things come full circle. Look at the way in which in the Chilean revolution, when Allende was elected in 1970, it was the music of Victor Jara which married together the music of the indigenous and poorest people of Chile with, yes, Western music and Western music ideas. But where do Western music ideas come from? Where's the history of pop music come from? You trace it all back to Black American music in the first place. Music, everybody thinks they're developing something that's never happened before in music. In reality, it is a new layer on a new layer on a new layer. And the poetry of today is actually rap.
And my very last question is, what are you going to be listening to on the convoy when you go to Cuba?
When I go to Cuba, it's got to be Guantanamera. You can't not listen to Guantanamera in Cuba. You know.
Okay.
Guantanamera, Guantanamera. It's a beautiful song.
Fidel Castro's favorite song, I think.
I believe it was, and I think it is, and it really has stood the test of time. There's a few songs that do, Guantanamera, Imagine, and a few others just stand the test of time.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and good luck on the convoy.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching that interview with Jeremy Corbyn. If you're interested in more of my content, check out my past interviews with people like James Schneider, the co-founder of Momentum, or Dr. Mo, a doctor who came back from Gaza.